But I think, just to put this in a nutshell, that many basic social values are passed on unconsciously, already in babyhood. Adults convey a great deal to babies about the kind of society they're living in. And, the most basic level, for example, whether the world is supportive and safe or challenging and dangerous. And all of us in different ways are working with the unloving side of society in a way and trying to find ways to offer a more caring response. And particularly those people who are working in Africa are often doing really cutting-edge work in dealing with traumatic social problems such as the AIDS epidemic, the aftermath of war, homelessness, and so on. Whilst probably the majority of you who've actually made it here today for your creative energy into, I'm sure, wonderful but probably more tried and tested kind of projects. The glass ceiling is an idea familiar to many. It refers to the invisible barrier that seems to exist in many fields and which prevents women from achieving senior positions. Less well known, but arguably a more pernicious problem, is the glass cliff. Originally recognized by academics Michelle Ryan and Alex Haslam back in 2005, this is the phenomenon of women making it to the boardroom but finding themselves disproportionately represented in untenable leadership positions. Ryan and Haslam presented evidence that women were indeed starting to secure seats at boardroom tables. But the problem was that their positions were inherently unstable. These women would then find themselves in an unsustainable leadership position from which they would be ousted with evidence of apparent failure. The title of their paper sums it up: Women are overrepresented in precarious leadership positions. Subsequent research in an array of environments has demonstrated that this is not an isolated issue, nor is it unique to certain industries or geographical locations. It reveals that women in top leadership positions seem to be routinely handed inherently unsolvable problems. Your accent really reveals a lot about who you are and your identity. It will tell people what your native language is, be able to tell you probably where you come from. Mark Pell, a communications professor at McGill University in Montreal. And according to Pell, one reaction to a different accent can be a bias against that person. Previous research that has been done elsewhere showed that people who have an accent tend to be trusted less, simply because they have an accent. But the idea that we would have a bias against anyone who sort of doesn't sound like us, I think probably relates to some sort of evolutionary or long-standing suspicion we have of outsiders or strangers. So this might be sort of an ingrained response that we have to the accent. But accents aren't the only thing we listen for when we have to decide if we trust another person. Tone of voice also plays a role. Pell and his team wanted to know if people would trust a confident tone, even if it came from someone with an accent. Teamwork can also lead to inconsistency, a common cause of poor sales. In the case of a smartphone that a certain company launched, one director wanted to target the business market, and another demanded it was aimed at consumers. The company wanted both directors to be involved, so gave the product a consumer-friendly name, but marketed it to companies. The result was that it met the needs of neither group. It would have been better to let one director or the other have his way, not both. Now, industriousness, or hard work. It's easy to mock people who say they work hard. Carbon-rich soil is dark, crumbly, and fertile, and retains some water. But erosion can occur if soil is dry, which is a likely effect if it contains inadequate amounts of carbon. Erosion is of course bad for people trying to grow crops or breed animals on that terrain. In the 1970s and 80s, Lal was studying soils in Africa so devoid of organic matter that the ground had become extremely hard, like cement. There he met a pioneer in the study of global warming, who suggested that carbon from the soil had moved into the atmosphere. This is now looking increasingly likely. Urban development is the first thing I wanted to talk about here in Perth. Urban development is going on at a great pace, and the standard approach here in Western Australia is for suburban development to happen at the outer edges of the city. You have suburbs slowly spreading out into areas that are cleared. And this is eating into both areas of native bushland and land that used to be used for farming, for agricultural purposes. The debate here is that on one side there's the idea that we need more housing. We have a housing shortage in Western Australia, and suburban expansion is essential. Suburban expansion on the edges of the city is cheaper and easier to do than building more homes within the city, even though it's recognized it creates lots of problems with infrastructure and so on. On the other side of the debate, people say that urban sprawl is destroying bush and consequently the natural wildlife that exists there, and that it's too easy for developers to ignore these facts. How would you define reasonable as it is used in law? For example, you are allowed to use reasonable force when defending yourself. It seems to depend on how serious the situation was, whether it was possible to resolve it by peaceful means, whether you were ready to try those means, and, finally, the relative strengths of those involved. Now, most men know, and they've probably grasped this from their earliest years in the school playground, that, when it comes to blows, fights don't stop until one of you is in no shape to do any damage to the other. The criteria mentioned seem a bit fuzzy to me. How can you convince a jury you were ready to try and talk your way out of it when the other person would have none of it and, besides, he was quick to land the first punch? Also, you can strike the first blow and still plead self-defense. Of course, you again have the problem of convincing people that the threat was so great that you had no alternative, apart from getting beaten up yourself. Reacting calmly and rationally to a perceived threat is not easy to do. They see triggers all over the world. What are triggers? Triggers are cases where you take a part of your nervous system and you say, if someone says that word, they can control my nervous system and make me afraid and anxious. That's a terrible idea. We should not be teaching our kids to see the world as being full of triggers. We should teach them to live in a world that is physically quite safe but full of offensive statements and ideas, especially on the internet. A sad commentary on the state of the business world now is that Google is being sued from both sides, from women who say that they're victims of a hostile climate, and from conservatives and white men, who say that conservatives and white men are discriminated against. So in our current era, everybody feels there. It looked like rain. The sky was gray. It was almost noon, but the sun was hidden by a gray blanket. It was cool. There were no birds flying anywhere. A couple of birds sat on the telephone wire. Bob was standing outside talking to Bill. They both had their hands in their pockets. They knew that it was probably going to rain shortly. A sudden breeze blew some leaves off a tree onto the sidewalk. A young woman wearing a dark blue coat and jeans walked by. She was walking a small dog. It was pure white and pretty. It sniffed at a tree trunk. The woman waited patiently. Finally, the dog lifted its leg. Bob said that he liked the rain. It was a nice change from the usual hot Los Angeles weather. And the plants could always use the extra water. Bill said the only thing he didn't like about rain was that all the motor oil on the streets would get washed into the ocean, and so would all the trash. But that never stops the surfers, Bob said. They don't seem to care what's in the water, as long as there are waves to surf on. This story is not about space, exactly. But it is about rockets, the model kind, and the kids who may grow up to launch the real thing into space someday. A trio of teenage Texas model rocketeers beat out teams from France and the UK to claim top honors at this year's International Rocketry competition. The U.S. team, from a 4-H club in Georgetown, Texas, won the June 21st fly-off at the Paris Air Show. They earned their spot in the international showdown by besting 99 other American teams. The contest required rocket kids to send a raw egg into the sky, as close to 750 feet altitude as possible, in a flight lasting between 48 and 50 seconds and bring the egg safely back to Earth. Brothers Mark and Matthew Ginecca and their teammate Daniel Kelton won the international contest with a flight that only peaked at 703 feet, but lasted a textbook 49.18 seconds. After the competition, the Texas teams got to meet with French President François Hollande. The president wore a dark suit and tie, and the boys from Texas wore windbreakers and cowboy hats. Fitting for space cowboys. Our skin tells us about our surroundings by detecting temperature, pressure, and other external conditions. If a pot handle is too hot to touch, we can feel this heat before burning our hand. Robots may someday have this protection too. A team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, has developed a large area sensor network integrated into a thin plastic film that acts like an electronic skin. They demonstrated the concept with an e-skin sample about the size of a postage stamp that lights up in the specific places it's touched. The work is in the journal Nature Materials. The harder the e-skin gets pressed, the brighter the light. The researchers envision that flesh and blood users could have an e-skin smart bandage that monitors wounds. A large sheet of the material covering the wall of a room could even operate like a display screen. And a robot with such a surface could more effectively interact with its environment. Of course, we don't want our robots to be too sensitive. Then they might balk at cleaning up nuclear waste or spending years at a time all alone on Mars. You may need to purchase an academic gown before the commencement. You must be able to work in a team. She used to be the editor of the student newspaper. Art is an expression of creative skill and imagination.